Welcome, and it's a great honor to have you. I watched your documentaries on the telly and now on History Hit, and now I'm listening Ancients on podcast all the time, so I'm familiar with your voice.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It was lovely to get your email. And yeah, I think I've seen a few of your comments on certain Ancients podcast episodes as well. So, yes, no, very happy to be here.
If somebody lived under the rock and don't know the History Hit and don't know of you, can you please tell us about yourself, your path into history, and what drew you into storytelling as way of engaging with the past?
Yes, of course. So I basically do all things ancient history at this company called History Hit, which is, I guess, a history education company. We create documentaries. So we have a whole TV team. We have like a subscription service of releasing new history documentaries every week. But we also have a whole podcast network, and I host the ancient history podcast called The Ancients. And we have quite a rich YouTube channel as well, once again, covering all different periods of history and social media channel. Yes, I do ancient history at History Hit. So one day I'll be exploring the ancient Greeks in Italy. The next day it's the last Neanderthals, and the day after that it's the fall of Rome or Mesopotamia, and so on. Quite a lot of history, ancient history that I cover. So I can't say I know everything about everything. A lot goes in one ear and ultimately will end up going out the other. However, I guess I could say I know a little about a lot of different topics. But my path into it, I studied ancient history at the University of Edinburgh, and after graduating from Edinburgh, I managed to get a job at History Hit quite a few years back now. I'm not going to say how many years because that makes me feel old, but I joined History Hit when it was very small, when it was still a startup, and I kind of rose as the company rose. It was really interesting to see, really exciting to be part of that. So much so that we're at the state now that we recently won an award for the best factual channel in Britain. It's been quite a journey, but yes, I cover all lots of ancient history topics now at History Hit.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of your work, huge fan of Dan Snow work, because you are a hero in my world, you and Dan, to be honest. So, do you remember the first historical event or character from history that captured your imagination, that kind of put you in that path? Oh, I like history.
Oh, I guess when I think the earliest history thing that I read or heard about, I guess, it's always fuzzy when you're very, very young. But I did get a book all about Greek myths when I was a very, very small, and learning about the stories of Odysseus in kids' form. So I guess Odysseus was one of the first figures that I learnt a lot about, because there were a lot of tales in the book about his many different wanderings back to Ithaca. Since then, Odysseus has not really been at the forefront of my interest. I grew up playing a lot of video games in the 2000s, like Rome Total War. So I got obsessed very early on with some of those key figures. I guess with my personality, I do like exploring figures lesser known. So I found a figure who I keep going back to time and time again, Pyrrhus, who fought the Romans and is seen as kind of one of the greatest of Alexander the Great's successors. And that kind of led me into military ancient history, which I guess is my main area. That's what I did the book around. That's what I was most interested in when growing up. But after doing the podcast over the last 5 years, my interests have expanded more from that back into art and architecture as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about as the chat goes on. But I guess in answer to your question, I'll have to go with the answer of Odysseus.
Yeah. When I was a kid in Sarajevo, there was this very cool program that they did, introduction of Greek mythology, and they would have muses. They would come to this painter that would paint huge jars of the theme for that episode. First, I learned all Greek alphabet. I can Latin, but also I can do Cyrillic. I'm coming from Bosnia, so well,
Ah,
this is how you say uh, Bosnian medieval script that's
wow.
only unique for Bosnia. So this program was only to introduce history to the kids and art. I saw this guy painting Odysseus or Jason, and then I start to paint to mimic him. And I said, "Oh my God, when I grow up, I want to do that."
Well, amazing. I'd love to do more on the Ancients podcast, more on Balkan ancient history and archaeology, like Bosnia and so on. We've done episodes in the past on the Illyrians. I'm quite tempted to explore, I know it's quite a tricky topic, but to explore what do we know about the origins of the Slavic people and understand a bit more about that, but also just kind of understand a bit more about that area. I'm sure Bosnia's got some amazing ancient history and archaeology too.
Yes, I did an episode called First Bosnian Art. 13,000-year-old engraving of wounded horse.
Oh, wow.
So Magdalenians engraved a horse. It is full of arrows. It's really, really fascinating art piece that nobody knows about. Let's get back to the ancients.
Yes.
How to define history? Is it science? Is it storytelling? Is it art? Or something that I cannot think of right now? Something else entirely?
Well, the basic thing is you think it like prehistory, so you would think the time before writing, before the written word, and then history is from when we have written documentation from onwards. So you could say history starting with Mesopotamia and cuneiform, so with the written words, 5,000 years or so. But at the same time, you could label Britain 5,000 years ago as being in the prehistoric world. I mean, until the Roman invasion of Britain in 43 AD. So we kind of do lots of prehistory and history. It's fun exploring the differences between them. So I find on the Ancients podcast, when we're doing topics from history, let's say with the Greeks and Romans, you can do much more narrative histories. For instance, when we did recently the story of the sacks of Rome with Professor Peter Heather in May, starting at about 400 AD, looking at the sources that we have, and then going all the way down towards the end of the 5th century when the Western Roman Empire is very much on its knees, but exploring these different historical accounts of what happens and the damage, the scale of the two sacks of Rome that happened in that time. But when you're exploring prehistory, there's less of that narrative idea. It's more exploring what we know about these people from archaeology, how certain monuments from our distant past, whether it be a great chambered tomb like Newgrange or a timber circle like Seahenge or something else, what the archaeology is suggesting from that site and other sites as to how that monument was used by people we still don't know much about because they left no written records behind. So it's always interesting that kind of divide between what you call prehistory and history. But I always find that when we do episodes on them, you always have a very different approach to them because of the nature of our surviving sources.
That picture behind you, or photograph
Yes.
behind you, is that in Scotland?
That is Duncarlow Broch in Scotland. This is a particular broch that I am yet to go to. I kind of bought this image, one, because it looks nice, and and two, to keep pushing me to actually continue my exploration of brochs in the Highland of Scotland by next going to this one on the Hebrides, in the Outer Hebrides. Yes, so they're Iron Age towers, extraordinary dry stone structures.
I think I saw a documentary on History Hit video about it. It's very interesting how they build it, and there's no mortar in it.
Exactly. These are dry stone Iron Age towers. They're homes, but they were centers of communities. They could also be farmhouses as well. Probably also could have served a defensive function too. They were multi-purpose, and depending where you were in the Highlands of Scotland or the islands, they could differ on their primary purpose. It is my favorite part of prehistoric Britain. I love the story of the Brochs and their architecture. And as you say, yes, one of the key points with the Brochs is that alongside their height, for some that have survived up to like 8-9 meters tall, like the Brocha Musa, Duntelv, Duntrodden, and so on, is also how extraordinarily well made they were. Some better than others. It's not that there was like one Broch expert that went all across the Highlands of Scotland and they repeated the idea, but the same general idea, kind of a circular construction and then kind of a slant inwards and then tapering as it goes further up. So you kind of get that chimney shape with then a thatched roof at the top. And then also learning that within had several levels. So you had the central level at the bottom. Then you can see still surviving at certain Broch sites an internal staircase that would have led you up to the second level and maybe a third level as well. They are such extraordinary structures. I don't know how much you know about the Brochs, Eldon.
I know everything about everything and nothing in particular. I don't know how to explain it because when I study art history in my secondary art school and then art academy in Sarajevo, we learned everything and we mentioned everything. We mentioned Brox, but it was maybe 2 lines. And then we mentioned Orkneys,
Yep.
but we put emphasis on Egypt and Greece and Mesopotamia and India and China and so on. As the time progressed, we put emphasis on the artists themselves. I ask all historians this. What role do personal bias and national myths play role in shaping history?
When it comes to ancient history, it's very, very interesting because I almost start all of our narrative stories on the ancients, when we're talking about particular topics, let's say from the Greek or Roman world or other parts of the world from a time where we do have written sources, I do ask early on in all our chats, what types of sources do we have? And almost always the professors will then highlight the written texts we have. Let's say if we're talking about the Persian Wars, they'll be mentioning Herodotus, or the Peloponnesian War, Sparta versus Athens. They'll mention Thucydides and Xenophon. Or, of course, Hannibal's invasion of Italy. In the Second Punic War, they'll mention like Livy and Polybius. And then afterwards, straight away, they will clarify stuff by saying how reliable certain sources are. Well, you certainly can say that there are some literary accounts that have less bias than others, but I think regardless, there will always be even a subtle level of bias in the certain narratives that you have if the history is written by someone who was clearly linked to one side of the conflict or the story than the other. So I think to get complete objective history, I think is very, very difficult, because also you need to remember that these historians, these sources would have been using, in certain cases, they would have been using sources of their own. And then they sometimes clarify, oh, I heard this from this person, or I heard that from that person. And it's almost impossible that the sources that they were using didn't have a bias of their own. So I would actually just say quite strongly, no, I don't think any of our surviving sources have complete objectivity. I think many of our sources do try it. I think Herodotus actually is really, really interesting in the fact that he loves including stories. He says, oh, well, I heard something from X, and some of the stories that he includes are more mythical than others. But he includes them and he kind of lets the reader decide what they think, what they believe. And others, like Thucydides, let's say, when he's talking about the account of Athens versus Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. Now, we know that he served as an Athenian commander in that war, and we know that there's one particular part of the story where he doesn't really do very well as an Athenian commander. In fact, I think he loses his command. He might be exiled as well. I can't quite remember the exact details. He takes away some of the blame from himself when he's covering that particular chapter. Same with the histories of Alexander the Great. There is a clear tendency to promote the achievements of Alexander by our surviving sources, and also sometimes to smear the reputations of certain adjutants, certain officers of Alexander who weren't quite liked by the people who ultimately wrote the history. I would say no, I don't think you can ever get truly objective literary accounts from the sources that we have. It's quite a strong point for me to say, but just having done all these interviews with people over time, we always highlight early on the nature of our sources, the nature of our literary accounts, and understanding the background to why they're writing these accounts and how they're linked to the events they're describing, which almost inevitably leads them to having a degree of bias in how they're writing their account.
Did history then happen? Yes, there was Rome, there was Greece, there was. But what if, let's say, Xenophon, who went on a rampage through ancient Persia, what if he invented some details that never happened just to boost his ego, and we have only him as a source, and he said, I was a general. Maybe he wasn't.
I think it is more when you get to the nitty-gritty details, because I'm sure other historians would have said, well, hang on, that's a bit too far. You can't say that completely. I do agree, though. I think it is when you get to the nitty-gritty details that you can see, especially if it's someone like Xenophon. I love Xenophon. I think he's a great source, but maybe he bigs up his role in certain things if he wants. I don't think you can say you can completely rule that out. I think that my favorite thing is when we have a written account of something, a big event, and then you can cross-reference that historical account with surviving archaeology, inscriptions, or evidence being unearthed from the ground, or another literary source. The one that I always go back to with this one is the story of Boudica and her revolt against the Romans. So, of course, we have the account in Tacitus, primarily. We also have Cassius Dio writing a bit later. There's a clear agenda there with his portrayal of Boudica as this strong kind of female figure, but with all the qualities of a man, and the great speech she gives to her soldiers as well. It's a very more kind of focus on Boudica's character for Cassius Dio's own portrayal of Roman history and this noble, savage, barbarian idea. But then again, not really noble, because she then cuts off the breasts of women that they capture in storming settlements like London and Colchester, and then crucifying them as well. So a little bit of a tangent there. I'm not going to go down that route. However, with the story of Tacitus, I mean, let's say that we know that Boudica sacked 3 particular cities, Colchester, London, and St. Albans. And we know from archaeology now that beneath the streets of modern-day Colchester, there is that clear, distinct burnt layer that dates to around 60-61 AD and has evidence of glass basically just being liquefied, molten glass, which shows that the temperature of the fire was up to 800 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. I don't know which one. But effectively, it was very hot. It confirms that Boudicca sacked the city, effectively confirms it at that time, and it was a massive fire. You got carbonized bread, you got burnt pottery, you got beautiful gold that was hidden and never retrieved by Romans who were fleeing the onslaughts of Boudicca and her warriors. I think my favorite thing, Eldon, kind of making a bit of a segue into that, is when we do have a literary account, and of course, then historians will continue to do so. They'll be scrutinous of the surviving literature and the sources. But when you get cases like that, where you can actually find archaeology from the places that they mention that seem to affirm what the literature has been saying. And it's stuff like that which I love the most because the archaeology reveals more about the actual people. The literature can give you a sense of the context, and when they work hand in hand together, quite frankly, there's nothing better, in my opinion.
Does history repeat itself?
So these are some of the big questions that normally I try to avoid because they get very philosophical. And of course, it brings you more into the modern day as well. But I'll give you my thoughts, my instant thoughts on it. And, over time, I may well change my mind. I think history repeats itself to a degree. I think that you can look at events in the modern day and understand that they are unique, that they are unlike anything that the world has experienced before because of the context of the world at this moment in time, with technology, with how connected we all are, and so on. And yet at the same time, you can look at human behaviors, relatable human behaviors between now and 2000 years ago, because they are humans as well. They're very different to us in the ancient world, like their attitudes towards violence and so on. But in other ways, they are very relatable as well. You can start to look at similarities. For instance, you can look at how people can be attracted to certain ideas and certain beliefs by the charisma of the person talking. And then that makes you think of maybe like the demagogues of ancient Athens and how they can be riled up to follow certain beliefs. But other stuff, you can look at just human attitudes towards things happening in the world. I remember doing an interview very recently learning about the fall of Rome and the origins of the fall of Rome and interviewing a professor, Dr. David Gwynn, fantastic man, when he was looking at the accounts from, let's say, 4th century, 5th century Roman Empire, and how in the accounts you get these stories of these Roman writers, these historians, who can't fathom a world without Rome. This idea that they couldn't ever see the Roman Empire falling. And there's only like one unique account where there is actually someone who's considering a world where Rome actually did fall, who's actually considering the inevitable. And it's interesting to think, are there thoughts nowadays? Is there thoughts in our belief? We've been quite comfortable in the world state, at least I'd say it's fair to say in Western Europe and in America, where we have been living very much feeling at the forefront of the world or the like. It's hard to imagine a world where there isn't that kind of US hegemony almost idea, or there's thought that powers like that could ultimately fall. But is that kind of following an idea in the past of just being unable to fathom such a drastic change in the world? I don't want to delve too much into that because that's too much modern history for my liking. But I hope I'm getting my point across. There can be events that you can look at in ancient history, in medieval history, and you can draw parallels up to an extent with the modern world. The context is different, but if you're studying the humans themselves and the events that they're driving, that you can sometimes see similarities. And I think that's when a newspaper company or a media outlet will ask a certain renowned historian to write an article or two, asking what parallels can we see between this catastrophic event happening today and a catastrophic event from the ancient world, because I think people do like seeing similarities up to a degree.
Okay, I will not ask you anymore about that, even though that I have more questions about it.
You can. I'll try and give you the best that I can. It's just I feel a little uncomfortable doing it, but I'm more
No,
than
no, no, I
happy
will not.
if
I
you
will
want.
not. I will not. But I will ask you one other thing. Uh, when did the Roman Empire stopped being a Roman Empire?
Oh goodness me. Yeah, what could you go the last time that the Roman Empire is united in 395? Or do you go the fall of Rome itself, the last Roman emperor in 476? Do you then go to 1453, right? With the fall of Constantinople and the Turks? I would go just for the sake of antiquity, I would probably go this idea of Rome in 476, because that's the idea of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and you get the emergence of these so-called successor kingdoms, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths are already there in southern France, and the Franks emerging, really emerging to the fore in northern France and so on. You've got the Vandals prominent for still a few more decades before Belisarius comes along and retakes that for the Byzantines, as we call them, for the Eastern Roman Empire. I think it depends where you are in the world, because we seem to have this tendency that we stop calling the Romans in 476 and then start calling them Byzantines to highlight the Eastern Roman Empire. But elsewhere in the world, people just keep calling them Roman and saying, well, the Roman Empire just lives on. And they're absolutely fair to say, because the Roman Empire does live on with Justinian and the Eastern Roman Empire. There is part of me that does feel attracted to saying 395, because that is the last time that the whole Roman Empire is one complete body. But at the same time, the Roman Empire has divided before that as well. And it's only in kind of this unique figures, Constantine the Great earlier in the 4th century, Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. There's only those brief times when the empire is united again, because quite frankly, by the 4th century, they'd realized that the Roman Empire was simply just too big. It couldn't be controlled by one man. That's why you start seeing these divisions of power, and ultimately the formal splitting of the Roman Empire. So another of those multi-million dollar questions. I'll just go 395, because that's the last time that the Roman Empire is united under one figure. But
Yeah.
ultimately, it does continue.
I spoke with many historians, and they all have different opinions
Different
about
answers, and they're
it.
all valid. They are all completely valid answers as well. I
Yes,
know you're asking the big questions, Eldon. So I'll give you as good as I can.
I would like now to speak a little bit about art. Can art redeem history? What is it that we like about, not only aesthetically, but historians, what they can draw from it? There's two questions, sorry, but
No, I think it's a great question, because that's a brilliant case of where you have the art surviving, and first of all, just being a tourist, just admiring it, being stunned by the quality and how it has survived over hundreds of years. And then the fact that, this is art, I mean, usually, as long as it's not in an imperial palace setting, which tells a story about a particular person or a particular family. Let's say, if we keep with Greece and Rome, first of all, in the ancient classical world. And what I love with certain pieces of art is that even if we have the images surviving, the context of the image itself sparks so much debate. What does this image mean? Why did they put this image down? Let's say if it represents a hunt. Is this representing a hunt that the owner of a villa enjoyed? Is this more a symbol of status? Is this a topic of conversation if they've got friends coming over, and that they can show, yes, I paid this famous mosaicist to create this image of a hunt and what it represents? This is this idea that I also partake in this elite sport, and kind of once again, kind of showing off their money, their prestige, their power. I think what art does, and what I love, having done a few documentaries which focus in on particular artworks, is that the stories behind the art, if you just have the art and the archaeological context of the place where it was discovered, it lets historians debate what is the purpose of it? What does it mean if the message is ambiguous? What is the message that the person who ordered the creation of this art wanted to get across, and to who? I think it opens up so many interesting questions that I think is very alluring to people, not just academics, but everyday people as well. I think it's no surprise that on the Ancients podcast, some of our most popular episodes focus sometimes on quite enigmatic, extraordinary works of art from the ancient and prehistoric world. I mean, last year we did an episode on Lascaux Cave and understanding the meaning behind all those depictions of various prey animals for these Ice Age people, and maybe even this evidence of proto-writing alongside these depictions of bison, of aurochs, mammoths, and so on, maybe alluding to when in the year these groups of prey animals were all together, and the hunters would then make sure that they were in the vicinity where they knew that these herds of prey would be gathering, maybe to reproduce or to give birth, and so on, so that they could be there to take advantage of the food supply that they offered. So I do think art, especially when the surrounding context is enigmatic, opens up so many questions, gives us an insight, a fascinating theoretical insight into the lives of those people who aren't emperors, who aren't historians, who aren't covering the big battles, giving a sense of life in these ancient empires and kingdoms, from some 2000 or so years ago. But I'll do a couple of focused examples, just ones that I've found really interesting over the years. The first one we'll talk about is that example to Dr. Adam Brum. He was part of a team which discovered on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi a few years back now the oldest known evidence of animals being depicted in human art. And these three warty pigs, beautiful warty pigs. And I believe since then they've discovered even older art from the region. It shows how rich the art history of Indonesia is from these early Homo sapiens coming down there 50,000 years ago or so. They were beautifully preserved. These three extraordinary warty pigs that were some 45,000 years old, found in a cave in Sulawesi. There was what they called cave popcorn, which had survived so that they could date it some 45,000 years ago. And there were also some hand stencils as well. So you saw handprints of the people who made this art, 45,000 years ago. They evidently saw these Sulawesi warty pigs, their prehistoric equivalent. I think they were a bit larger back then, but they still exist today, or at least descendants of those pigs. But they're stunning, beautiful purple color as well. To think that they were created on this cave wall 45,000 years ago in that color with those details and the hand stencils surviving is extraordinary. And so it gives you an amazing insight into people tens of thousands of years before writing is invented, deep in the Ice Age. When I heard news about that discovery, late 2020, I think, because I recorded with Adam early 2021. So actually, it was very early 2021 because it's a breaking news story. It was just an extraordinary insight. So much we still don't know, but that just gives you a glimpse. And going forward, tens of thousands of years later, another example of art that I just wanted to highlight as a brilliant example, but quite different. If we go to the ancient Greek city of Paestum or Paestum in southern Italy, which was a prominent Greek city in southern Italy before the rise of Rome. So for context, the Greeks spread in western Turkey. They even colonized what is today Crimea and north of the Black Sea, also North Africa and southern France. Marseille, the oldest city in France, is originally ancient Greek foundation. But they also founded many different colonies in southern Italy and Sicily. And one of the most prominent, one of the most fascinating you can go to today is Paestum or Paestum in southern Italy, renowned for its massive ancient Greek temples. Three stunning ancient Greek temples that survive, some of the best in the world. But Paestum is also famous for its wall paintings. And its most iconic wall painting is from the 5th century BC, and it's an iconic Greek wall painting, and it's known as the Diver. It's from a tomb called the Tomb of the Diver. It shows a young man diving into water. And I had the privilege of going to Paestum and to interview the director, Tiziana D'Angelo, Dr. Tiziana D'Angelo, all about it for a documentary recently. Not yet come out, but I'm really excited when it does. I was able to see it basically just with her and the crew. It was fantastic. You see this young adolescent figure. He's got a small beard, so not a full beard, so a small beard, which shows that he's an adolescent, so a teenager, diving off a platform, a little bit of tree cover either side, a little bit of foliage, and then a bit of water that he's diving into. And it's obsessed historians, art historians for decades. What is the meaning of this image? Many different theories. One is that it represents the passing from youth into adulthood. Others is this actually just a dive, just someone diving into water and a favorite pastime of this figure? Or again, is it more kind of philosophical, theoretical? Is it to show this young man who may have been the person who died when he was young in that tomb? And it's as if he was jumping from life into the afterlife. And so kind of a metaphoric meaning as well. But I just wanted to mention those two examples, one from 45,000 years ago and one from classical Greek times, how you have these astonishing artistic discoveries and how they give you an insight, and yet they also raise so much debate about their meaning to people today.
I spoke with many artists. Sometimes artists do lines, doodling, just to fill this area of blank space, because sometimes artists don't like blank spaces.
I'm not being assertive enough. There certainly are cases. I mean, Pompeii is a fantastic example of that when you look at all the graffiti, believed to have been created by children, just showing gladiators and people fighting in the arena. And very much this idea that the children saw the gladiators fighting either in the arena or at the gladiator school, and then created that image. In one case, they etched it onto a nearby wall, and on another case, used charcoal to create kind of stick figures and then showing them fighting. So that's a fascinating example, A, where you're getting an insight into children from this Roman town some 2,000 years ago, and B, you are just getting an example of them drawing what they saw and keeping themselves occupied when they have some free time to do it.
So many things that we don't know and some things we know. But What role does emotion play in how we process the past when we see a great painting or a sculpture? And can we trust those feelings?
Yes, but I think that's also why there is such a rich diversity of opinions on certain pieces of art and what they mean. Well, you mentioned earlier how, is there actually any objective history? And I said probably not. And I think that's still true today with how we write history. We try to be objective as possible, but at the same time, we are writing with the surviving evidence. And, we might want to focus on one particular aspect of the story than another. I think once again, it's the same with modern day art historians looking at ancient art. I think there is also a desire to try and find new meaning behind certain pieces of art, new context, if it's possible, because it shows that you're creating new ideas around it. And I welcome that. I think that's brilliant. And that's the great thing with ancient history is that you kind of explore those ideas. But no, I think emotion is a big driver behind the creations of arts and the beautiful nature of so much of it. I think it's also the cultures that they were living in at the time, what they recognized as being acceptable quality in art, and so on. So, yes, I would say presumably emotion. Well, yes, emotion is a big part of the art.
There's a lot of people who see an ancient piece of art or architecture, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, or most famously, pyramids of Egypt. Now, in the last maybe 5, 6 years, Göbekli Tepe. And there's so many conspiracy theories. This channel, what I do, is product of that. I was so sick and tired of people speaking about giants who built the ancient pyramids. And what are your thoughts about that? How this became prominent knowledge that or hidden knowledge about ancients?
I think, quite frankly, there will always be those people who are intrigued in this idea of conspiracies and this idea that ancient civilizations did not have the sophistication to build the great monuments that you see today, or just ingrained with this idea that beyond a certain thousands of years, humans, yeah, just were incapable. They didn't have metal tools, they just had stone tools. So, how could they do something like that? Or they were just hunter gatherers. But I do think that greatly undermines, that greatly underestimates undervalues the capabilities of groups of people back in prehistoric times. I mean, a good example could be Skara Brae in Orkney. Going back when you talk about like the emotions behind the creations of art, one of the brilliant discoveries from Skara Brae, get these beautiful stone balls, amazing patterns on them as well. So many theories as to what they could have been. Could they have been toys? Could they have been weapons? Could they have been something else entirely? Or could they have been something to do with what they believed in, the divine? Different theories. It is fascinating. And once again shows that you don't exactly know the reasons as to why they create certain objects, especially when you go further back in time. But one of the best things about art and prehistoric art is that it allows lots of different opinions to come to the fore, and it's then trying to deduce what you think is the most plausible. But regards to Skara Brae, for instance, when Skara Brae was rediscovered in the 19th century, it was initially believed by the man who'd uncovered it and the man who first excavated it that this couldn't be Stone Age. The creation of this settlement is so extraordinary and sophisticated that it couldn't be done without the help of metal tools. And then later on, it was revealed, well, actually, it was. This was a Stone Age settlement some 5,000 years ago on Orkney. There will always be some people, first of all, who just like kind of going against the grain of academia and archaeologists and this idea that being very much riled up by this idea that they're being told by so-called experts what to believe and what not to believe. There will always be people like that, quite frankly. And conspiracy theory is just an avenue for them to talk about that. But that does actually take away revealing the extraordinary actual history. And let's be fair, those kind of conspiracy theories, they are in a minority. I'm always blown away when we do something like the pyramids or Göbekli Tepe, the good reaction we get when we interview actually the people at the site, the lead archaeologists. We did Göbekli Tepe recently with Lee Clare. I mean, he was fascinating. And he highlighted what the architecture they're revealing from 10,000 years ago, the art that they're revealing on some of the columns as well, those T-shaped pillars and so on, and what it's revealing about the nature of this society, what it might refer to, what it is revealing about humans at the end of the Ice Age, at a time that we normally associate with very early sedentism. And it was extraordinary, kind of shining a light on the animal figures that are shown as well, what that might allude to in regards to religion and so on. And I just do feel that sometimes conspiracy theories in that case are just a bit of a cop out. It's just not giving those prehistoric peoples the credit that they deserve for being able to create these societies thousands of years ago before people, in many cases, could actually believe that people were capable of doing it. I know what I will say is that I think the beauty of ancient and prehistoric art is the theories that can emerge from it, is the multitude of theories. And I welcome that, quite frankly. I love learning about the different interpretations of art. And yes, that does mean that certain theories will be more far-fetched than others. And yes, it is a case that sometimes those more far-fetched theories are the ones that intrigue the most people. And that's those the ones that certain documentaries will be created about because they know there'll be an audience for it. But then you'll also notice when you explore those documentaries, you'll see how they're using one particular strand of evidence or one little bit of evidence and then linking it to another very little bit of evidence and another, and then drawing a conclusion, and sometimes not always, but trying to say that that must be the most obvious theory. So when you understand that it's kind of only on a thin thread that they're kind of creating those ideas, then you can start being a bit more dubious. But at the same time, the fact that no one knows for sure means that it's just another theory. I'm not one going to say ban conspiracy theories or so on. It's up for people to make up their own minds. With me on the ancients, it's just let's get the best professors on who can talk about the archaeology, who can talk about what are the interpretations at the moment, but also highlight how with the discoveries of with new discoveries, their thoughts might also just change entirely.
Okay, so the last three questions before we wrap it up. What is art?
Oh goodness. Um, Art is effectively anything created by humans, I'd say, but with like a particular, maybe not say particular purpose in mind. Physical creations by humans, it's difficult because you don't say art and architecture, do you? If I think of art, I think of beautiful works on the sides of tombs and buildings and so on, built designed with a particular purpose in mind, if I think from the ancient world. But then again, I also think about graffiti and stuff from Pompeii. So I think anything that is created by humans, yes, and that has left a lasting imprint on the environment that it was placed on, whether that's handprints on the Tibetan plateau by Denisovans 200,000 years ago, whether it's 45,000-year-old depictions of warty pigs in Indonesia, whether it's tomb paintings from places like Paestum or cave paintings like Lascaux and the like. I think it took me a few works to think about it, but I think it's any creations that have been imprinted on a surface by humans with a particular purpose or an idea in mind that have stood the test of time today.
What about music then?
It depends how you define art. I would say physical art is like visible art.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd say what I define. I'd say music, I guess it's when you get a bit fancy with the word art in then that regards, yes.
Mm.
But I would say that's a different kind. I would look at art and I would think if we're talking about art, if I was wanting to do an episode on art, I would want to do something which is people can visibly see today, whether that can visibly imagine today. And if they search it in Google, they can find whether it be the Olmec heads, the Nazca lines, Paestum wall paintings, Pompeii, and so on. I
Mm.
also would differ it from architecture. Like that's why I kind of hesitated there by saying buildings, because I'd say architecture is different. The great Doric temples at Paestum. I'm using Paestum a lot just because I've used it recently, um, or the Pont du Gard aqueduct in France and so on. But that's just my thoughts. That's
Yeah.
just hastily thought up thoughts that have come to me. You're putting me on the spot on a topic I'm not used to, but I'll give you the
Yeah,
best I can.
yeah. I always ask everybody and I never get the same answers. And it's very I'm very fascinated by all answers and so many people, so many answers. The second question is, how would you like to be remembered?
Cop out answer would be ask me again in 5 years. I guess I'll answer that by just saying what drives me at the moment, which is just to provide an outlet in today's world where we can share these amazing stories from ancient history, prehistory, and archaeology with as many people as possible and share the work of these experts who we get on the show with as many people as possible, promote their work. So I guess I would like to be remembered as someone who really promoted ancient history and archaeology and the complex nature of it and not scared to delve into the details and show that there really isn't. I mean, the ancient history is not niche. There is just a general fascination in understanding the stories of these people who lived thousands of years ago, the works they created, whether art or architecture or music and so on, philosophy and academic and all that, and just confirm that there is a real big interest out there for it. So I would like to be remembered as someone who did very much contribute to the preservation, I guess, to the promotion of ancient history in the technological world that we live in today. You know, wherever I go, I'll always be doing ancient history and archaeology and trying to share it with people because that's what I love. I think there's still a lot for me to get better at. I think doing interviews like that, like this, I could become better at doing it as well. You can ask me again in 5 years, Eldon, and see how my thoughts have changed. But it's a privilege to have the opportunity that I do have and to just try and keep growing and being a better person and keep knowing why I do it, I think, quite frankly.
And this last question, if you could have a dinner or a beer or a cup of coffee or whatever you like, uh, with any ancient person, with any historical figure, even a character from a book, who would it be and why?
Oh, you know what? As long as I could be guaranteed that my life would be in safe hands, I'd like to have a drink with Alexander the Great just to get a sense of who the real man was. Who was the real Alexander the Third, a man who's shrouded in so much myth today? What do we actually know about his character, about his achievements? Just to sit down with him and actually hear from him, like his thoughts about it. I don't think there's many things better than that, to be fair.
Okay, thank you, Tristan, for this. I hope we will one day repeat this. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Eldon, and I hope you can get something succinct and enjoyable from our chat today.
Thank you for doing this, and I wish you a good day or good life.
Yes, I do hope there's some good stuff from there. I know there were quite big questions. I hope there's something that you can find good for you and your audience.
Yes, thank you. See you
Okay,
around.
take care,
Bye.
Eldon. Bye.
Bye.